The birth of a child is typically one of a parent's happiest moments, but all too soon thereafter, the questions and concerns often flood in. Is she healthy? Am I up to the task of raising him? Will she do well in school? Can we afford college? But what if the lovely child born unto you faced a mountain of biased and stunting statistics? Not because of who he was as an individual, but due to the society he was born in and the demographic groups he happened to fall into. Joining me to lend context to this issue is Frank Rudy Cooper, tenured professor at Suffolk University's Law School. With a scholarly focus on the policing of men of color, he is also the co-editor of the book Masculinities and the Law, a Multidimensional Approach. Welcome.
Thank you.
Pleased to have you.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here.
I should say at the outset that this interview was not easy for me to come by. Collecting a set of questions that we could discuss was a challenge. And I think the reason for that is useful for viewers to know. I think I was concerned about making a verbal faux pas, about exposing my ignorance. That my comments may hint at a racism, at a bias that I didn't know, that I hope does not exist in me. And my sense is that many of our viewers, given that 85% of Arlingtonians are white, if they're at all like me, also have limited experiences with people of color, and have a limited sense and understanding of what the experience of people of color is in this society. So this is all to say that I have an inadequate vocabulary for handling this discussion, I believe. Given your scholarship, your experience in academe, my sense is that you come with a better vocabulary for discussing the issue of race and racism in America. I'll ask your forbearance and tolerance and good humor as we go through this discussion.
Sure.
Yeah?
Absolutely. I don't think it'll be necessary.
Okay, well, thank you. We are both fathers. We've talked about this before. Your son happens to be the father of a college professor, which my son is not. And he has a very potent model of achievement, therefore, to make sense of, if not to live up to at some point. Yeah. Yet you contend that boys and young men of color risk their racial credibility, as it were, by succeeding academically in school. What do you mean by that?
You know, I think back to, I grew up here in Cambridge, right next door to Arlington. And when I went to the public schools and grammar school, I didn't experience much of this, but I got to high school, and one of my first experiences is semester in, I got an A average, and first, all the teachers in my program came up and said, "Frank, great job, way to go, good. Yeah. And then I had a friend of sorts, a peer, a year older than me, come up to me and say, you know, you're being white. What's going on with you? And that kind of experience is the danger of being seen as either being black or being high achieving.
Your son, I think, is in the neighborhood of 11 or so now.
Yeah, he just turned 11.
All right. Happy birthday to him.
Happy birthday, Theo.
Is this something that you have a sense that he's experienced to date?
Yeah, a little bit I do. Of course, it's hard to speak for an 11-year-old even. Already they're such, well-developed personalities, and they have their own sense of their own experience. Right. What I would say is that I observed that my son felt that he was being challenged for speaking up too much in class, for being a know-it-all, right. And that some of that may have been related to race, that he felt that he was particularly being challenged by other black boys or boys of color. And I think he felt special tension over the fact that it seemed to be black boys and other boys of color who were challenging him on speaking too much or knowing too much.
Right.
And that gets to sort of a little bit of what I was relating in my experience, that it's sometimes hard to know how to negotiate those relationships when you stand apart from people's stereotypes. And here I think what your lead is a good example of how it's just a complicated issue, because you say that, you know, you worry a little bit that as a white person who doesn't have a lot of interactions with other people of color, that you may make some sort of social faux pas. I think that people of color often have a hard time knowing how to relate to people of color in this diverse and majority white world. So when I think of kids, you know, what do they make of that if they see that most of the kids that are sort of held out as high achieving are white, and then they see this one black boy, and really there were many boys of color in his school who were high achieving, but a number of them had moved on by the time he had this experience, and so he sort of stood out. Right. And I think the kids, black and white and other, really had a hard time knowing what to make of that. It didn't fit their expectations.
Right. So one of the other things that we fathers are charged with is having important, if challenging, conversations with our sons. You know, the conversation about relationships and sex leaps immediately to mind. And yet I heard of, from a family friend recently, another conversation which I hadn't given thought to previously. She and her husband had the conversation with their son, who's black. And essentially it was the conversation about, were he ever to be confronted by the police, this is the way he should behave. Yeah. I have not had the conversation with my son. I've never felt the need to have that conversation with my son. And it feels as if being white in this country allows us the freedom to not have to think about our skin color. But here's my question to you from both a personal as well as an academic standpoint. Did your parents have that conversation with you? Have you had, do you imagine having the conversation with your son? What gets said there?
Yeah, it's funny because I don't remember having that explicit conversation with my parents, although I had very much internalized by the middle of high school, certainly, that I had to really behave myself around police officers, that there was some danger there. So I had that sense, and I'm not sure exactly where I got it from, which maybe is good, right? Sometimes we want to have conversations with our kids, but we don't want them to remember it as some heavy conversation. But certainly my wife Daniela and I have talked about having that conversation with Theo and when. And one of the things we've thought is that he just turned 11. It's not really time to have that conversation. Because we talk a lot about race and policing in my household, unsurprisingly, he has some consciousness that he has to be careful with the police without our having even said that to him.
There's a different standard, regrettably.
Yeah, unfortunately it seems that way, doesn't it? With all these incidents that have happened recently, and they're not new, they've just become more prominent in the news, which I'm glad to see in some ways, but it's sad the sort of cost that individuals have had to pay in order to have this conversation.
And that speaks to the idea that you write about in your work. The good black man idea, image, versus the bad black man image. Yeah. I mean, it sort of weaves its way with expectations in school, both from your peers as well as conceivably from your teachers. Right. Can you maybe fill us in a little bit more, because your work, while certainly focusing on law, goes into really the psychological dimension too, and what the lived experience of people of color is in terms of how do I make sense of what I feel to be true about myself and what I'm seeing reflected back from my culture.
Yes, I love the idea of what's being reflected back, because we have this sense of self-identity that's internal, but then people look at us and either explicitly or implicitly they tell us who we are. So when I think about the good black versus the bad black, looking at a lot of sociological and legal literature, I think it boils down to this. We know that there's an image of the bad black man, of the criminal, of the less intelligent black man. there's also implicitly an image of a good black man, which is that if you sort of prove that you're not those things, then if you're sort of a well-behaved black person or an acceptable black person, that you may get this sort of title that has been joked about for a long time in black culture of the good black.
Right.
I've just talked about a little bit about the dichotomy there, that it can be very hard to maintain that image of the good black unless you sort of hew the straight and narrow in all ways. And that, I think, is hopefully changing somewhat. And when I think of my son, I hope he doesn't feel like he's either of those things and can't sort of be just himself with, like most of us, some bad qualities, some good qualities, and make some mistakes.
The other thing that seems difficult to sort of to pull apart is how race, how education, and certainly connected to race in our country, how socioeconomic status, how these threads interweave into various perceptions in our culture. And how, again, any insights in terms of how we pull them apart and try to get a sense and a grasp of them and the interplay that they have for our community as a whole, but also in individual lives.
Yeah, I don't claim to have a perfect answer to that. I think that they are so intertwined that it is impossible to pull them apart completely. And therefore, sometimes maybe we focus on a certain arena, a certain context, and we see certain things are highlighted there, and we emphasize those aspects of identity, knowing that there are other aspects of identity that are equally or even more important. We've talked about race. Certainly masculinity matters a lot when it comes to racial profiling. I and others often shorthand it as though it's black people who are being racial profiled, targeted for suspicion by police in inner cities in particular. But it's a very specific group. It's young men of color, meaning mostly African American and Latino men in the inner city. And so we're talking about age, we're talking about race, we're talking about gender, we're talking about location. And if we talk about just the masculinities part of it, I think part of what's going on there is, I think it's harder for a cop to take disrespect from a young man in particular than it is to take that disrespect in one form or another from a girl or from an older woman. There may be dynamics at play in terms of the gender relationship that affect that. I just think that for a lot of cops, it's also particularly hard to have these young men mouthing off to them because respect is so important, really in both communities. Right? As a young man, a lot of times respect is particularly important vis-a-vis your peers. This is the time when young men get in a lot of fights. There's much more sort of aggression around, have I been treated the way I should be treated amongst these young men of color and other young men, white men. And then I think for police, there's a good reason and a bad reason why respect is so important. The good reason is that sometimes they have to take control of situations. The police in Arlington and elsewhere sometimes are going to have to take hold of a situation, maybe handcuff people, at the very least sort of be the person who says, that's it, you over there, and we're ending this situation right now. So that's the command presence that they have to demonstrate. And in that sense, they have to command respect. If they can't command respect, at some point they won't be able to do their job properly. Now, on the other hand, I think there's the sort of contempt of cop aspect of this, which is that rather than being punished for contempt of court, where you haven't done something in front of a judge that the judge wanted you to do, sometimes a cop will essentially punish you for contempt of cop, which is you didn't do what the cop asked you to do. So it's not a violation of the law, it's a violation of the cop's sense that you should listen to them. When I talk about a good sort of form of demanding respect, it's when they have to do their job and take control of situations. I think the bad form of it is they may sometimes come to expect that they be deferred to in all situations, even when the people involved haven't done anything wrong, and they might see just disrespecting them as a wrong.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
for joining me today. I appreciate it. I hope maybe we can talk again.
I hope we will soon.
All right, thank you. It's unlikely that our conversation today will measurably affect America's experience of race alone. But if it encourages dialogue and a shift in perspective, that's a start. So please take it as a challenge to engage in sometimes uncomfortable discussions with oftentimes incomplete vocabularies, in hopes of creating greater understanding and more promising futures for all of our children. For Professor Frank Cooper, I'm Peter Bermudez for Arlington Public News.